everybody. Welcome back to another episode of In the Green Room with Aidan Keene. It's been a while, but I'm happy to be back. And joining me today is a celebrated Hollywood author and historian who has written some incredible books like The Hollywood Heartbreak, Hollywood Haunted, and Dishing Hollywood. And she also co-wrote the wonderful memoir Timmy's in the Well, the Jon Provost story with her husband, and my friend from the podcast, Mr. Jon Provost. So I'm joined today by Laurie Jacobson. Laurie, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
I don't know how I just forgot to mention the book that we're going to be talking about today, but I failed to do that. An amazing book called Top of the Mountain, The Beatles at Shea Stadium, 1965. My favorite band of all time, so this is great. I'm really looking forward to talking about that with you.
Cool. My favorite band of all time, too. The Stones, they're very close, but, the Beatles were the first, and they beat them to it.
My favorite era is early Beatles. I call it early Beatles. I think from 60 to when they first started in England to about 65. I just love that music. So my first question for you before we really dive into the book is, did you get to see the Beatles live?
Did. I did. It was my first concert. My parents took me. My parents and their best friends all took their kids. And it was August 1966. And it was very close to their last concert. I think from there they went to LA or San Francisco. They closed the stadium in San Francisco. So within 2 weeks, they were no longer touring. So I just got in there and it was awesome.
That is awesome. I
You know,
guess
what I was going to say, when I wrote Top of the Mountain and I talked to a lot of people that were at Shea Stadium, and they remembered every second like it happened yesterday. And all the girls remembered what they wore and, and how they got there and how they got their tickets. I don't remember any of that. And I'm sure I chose my outfit very carefully, but I have we didn't no cell phones. We didn't take photos. It rained, which was a big deal with people with electric guitars. So
hmm
they did away with the opening acts, which were the Ronettes and
hmm
the Circle and
yes.
maybe one or two others. But they went right straight to the Beatles for their 29-minute performance of 9 songs. And it had just started to rain, so they hurried through their show. And I was not a screamer; I was a crier. I just thought, this is it. When am I ever gonna be in the presence of this again? And so I just took it in quietly and loved every second.
It's incredible. You are only the second person that I've met that got to see the Beatles. Another good friend of mine who's a fellow musician got to see the Beatles at Suffolk Downs in Boston, which I also believe was in 66. And said the
Well, and
same thing.
husband John, he got to see them twice.
Oh.
I know. And I had an invitation for a second time, but it involved getting on a private plane and flying to Kansas City from St. Louis, where I'm from. And my mother just said no. So I had seen him once and I just satisfied myself with that.
That's awesome. And one thing that you mentioned was you got to speak to so many people when writing this book, which was really cool because it's not just a typical rundown. It's basically like a fly on the wall kind of thing where you're hearing about from all these people that were there. So what was the most surprising story that you got to uncover when you were writing this book?
Hmm. Well, there were two things that I learned um, about the Beatles that really surprised me. Um, One was about their manager, Brian Epstein,
Mm,
um, and how dark his life really was.
yes.
I was, he was so poised and elegant, um, and he became a star in his own right. He was like on Shindig and American Bandstand, and very popular with Beatle fans. But he lived a very dark life as a closeted gay man. I mean, it was still illegal in the UK to be gay. So he literally could have gone to prison. And he was really popping a lot of pills. Mother's Little Helpers, pills were really popular in the 60s amongst parents, uppers and downers and diet pills and Valium. And Brian actually had secret little pockets sewn into his custom made suits where he could hide his pills. And also the men that he was was attracted to were very rough,
Hmm.
and sometimes he would show up beaten and bruised, and I think ultimately had a very low self-esteem, and um felt that it was punishing what he did to himself. So that came as a very big surprise to me. And the other thing that was so surprising was that, okay, first of all, the name of the book, Top of the Mountain. This came from a quote of John's. Years later, John was at a reggae concert with Sid Bernstein, who was the promoter of the concert, the one and only man in the world that believed the Beatles could play a baseball stadium and sell it out. No one else, including Brian Epstein, believed that. So he was really responsible for lifting them up above the crowd. And they're at this concert together, and they were reminiscing about Shea. And John said to him, I saw the top of the mountain on that incredible night. And truly, it was the peak of Beatlemania. But even though they were reaching their peak as the Beatles, their paths in different directions were already mapped out. And that really surprised me, because here they are still ascending the ladder, but John hated touring because nobody listened to them. They just wanted to see them and breathe the same air. I heard that quote over and over. I just wanted to breathe the same air. But he was really into the music, and he wanted to spend more time in the studio.
Yeah.
And George was discovering uh, India and Eastern music, and he was being pulled in that direction. Paul just wanted to tour, and that's pretty obvious because he's never stopped touring.
Right.
And Ringo, who stole the show in A Hard Day's Night, was now being offered all kinds of acting gigs. And he was behind the other guys. Now he had this opportunity to be in front. And so already they were being pulled in their divergent paths. And that was shocking to me. Here they are, they're the biggest gig they've ever had. And yet all of that was happening. They may not have been aware of it yet, but I was really surprised to see that.
And like you said, clearly Sid Bernstein was taking a massive gamble putting them in a stadium, especially at that time. And from your research, do you think that the Beatles realized how much was riding on that one night in their career?
No, and I don't think they realized it until they stepped out onto that field.
Mm.
And there is a movie of Shea, and you can see it on their faces, because first of all, no one had ever played to 56,000 people before. No one. Not Sinatra, not Elvis. They had done arenas, but not baseball stadiums. This was the first concert in a baseball stadium. So that was number one. Um, and like I said, they were the first. Or people may say, oh, I've listened to I Want to Hold Your Hand and I don't get it. What was the big deal? The big deal was that nobody had done music like that before. They were still going to the Brill Building in New York where songwriters were cooking up songs from, and singers would go door to the songwriters. Do you have anything specifically for me? And nobody was writing their own music and then performing it. So it just was so thrilling and exciting. The other thing is, they were so ready for their moment. I mean, they'd been playing together for years already. They'd gone to Germany where they made a huge sensation, and they were playing clubs where they had 2 and 3 shows a night. And they got all the kinks out of their act. By the time they came back to Liverpool, where they were revered, uh, they were polished.
Yeah.
Um, they probably played more live shows before they broke in the US than most acts today have ever played. They played hundreds of shows. And they were babies. It just, George wasn't even 21. When they found that out in Germany, they sent him back, because he didn't have a work permit. So it's just incredible how young they were, and and they figured out what to do in front of an audience. And then Brian Epstein came along and polished the rough edges off. Let's lose the leather jackets and go in the little collarless suits,
Mm.
and I want you to bow afterward. And um it just all pulled together. So they were instantly ready for their moment.
I always wonder what the history was behind the bow. They
Well,
always
I
interesting.
found I found this incredible guy. His name is Dave Glide, and he was in one of the opening acts. Sounds Inc. Sounds Incorporated was the name of their group. They were an instrumental group, and they happened to be playing in Germany when the Beatles were in Germany. And um, Dave, who's in his 80s, I couldn't even believe that I found him on Facebook. Like I just entered his name and it came up that he was playing a club in Australia where he lives. And I called the club and they put me in touch with him. And I live in the Bay Area now, and he has relatives here, and he came to visit his relatives, and we had the most spectacular day. It was he their band backed every American group that came over to the UK. It was too expensive to bring your band over. So just the lead would come over, and, just Little Richard would come over, and Sounds Inc. would back Little Richard, or Brenda Lee, or, just the list of people he played with was incredible. So they're in a club in Germany, and they hear an announcement that a UK band is about to take the stage. And he thought, well, I'll stay and listen to these guys, the Beatles, whoever they are. And he said, they were terrible. They sucked. They had no stage presence, and they just hadn't developed yet. But they were great guys,
Mm.
and they became great friends. And there were a lot of drugs going on when you're playing 2, 3, 4 shows a night. There were a lot of uppers involved.
Right.
And they quickly learned that Sounds Inc. could be trusted. Whatever happens in Germany stays in Germany. And also, whatever happens on tour stays between us. So when they got back to the UK, George Harrison said to Dave, "You we're being managed by this great guy, Brian Epstein. You should meet him." And then Brian took them on, and they often opened for the Beatles. And Oh boy, did he have some amazing stories, some of which I can't repeat, but they had a ball. And I would just love to see Paul or Ringo and tell them Dave Glide says hello, and that he's still playing, and so are they. That it's just so cool.
Well, that's one thing that amazes me. And, honestly, I think whenever someone asks me what I think the best thing about the Beatles is, it's the constant evolution. They were always evolving and building upon what they did prior. But I think it's amazing that the Beatles could go, well, they played 29 minutes, you said 20 minute, in the 20-minute mark somewhere. And now Paul McCartney, at over 80 years old, is doing 3-hour concerts. It's unbelievable how it just kept evolving. And my next question for you is not specifically about Shea Stadium, but it kind of leans on the evolution line. If the Beatles hadn't stopped touring in '66, which album do you think would have been the most impossible for them to recreate live?
The White Album, I
Mm,
think, has a lot of experimental music on it. And, once the um, anthology tapes came out and you heard the different versions of the songs
hmm
as they evolved, it's even more amazing to me. I mean, listen, I was 10 when the Beatles happened, and I didn't know very much about music. I just played the records, heard the songs, liked them, and that was it. But as I learned more about music and also all of the crazy sounds, whether they were ringing a bell or like for Yellow Submarine, I just, they were pulling on chains and um they're one of their 3 crew members, Mal Evans, said he had a big bass drum, and they all lined up in the studio and were singing, "We all" and marching around, and I'm thinking, "What a trip." And how do you decide this version is better than that version, and I'll just, play a song backwards here, and, it's just incredible how much went into that.
yeah.
I'm still blown away when I listen to it now, and now I have a really great stereo system in the car,
Yep.
I hear things I never heard before. The entire package is just amazing to me.
It is amazing, especially when you do hear it. I've been listening to the Beatles all my life, and I just turned 21. And, I know, but the other day, I was listening to Sergeant Pepper, the album, in my car, and I was listening really closely at some of Paul's bass lines. I didn't realize how difficult some of those bass lines really are. Because, I mean, the early songs, I can play those on bass, and I'm not a bass player, but they're pretty easy. But some of those Sergeant Pepper ones, and off the White Album too, they get very complex,
And that
which,
wasn't even his primary instrument,
right.
that was because, John's buddy, Stu Sutcliffe,
Hmm.
um, couldn't play anything but he wanted to play lead, and so that reduced Paul to bass, and then Paul talks about all these great bass players that influenced him to do this and that, and I'm like, "Whoa, I thought it was just thump, thump, thump," But, yeah, it's they and you have to hand it to George Martin, who,
Yes, absolutely.
understood and enhanced what they were doing. Really, it's crazy.
And
Crazy good.
even today, I mention this, it comes up in almost every episode. I'm a tribute artist. I have an Elvis show out here. And I think we live in the day and age of tribute bands. It seems like the most concerts around are tribute bands these days. But I think, aside from Elvis, and it might be even neck and neck, there are no, there's no greater number of tribute bands than there are for the Beatles. countless Beatles tribute bands, and so many of them can just so accurately nail the sounds. And it's amazing how today, with the technology that they have in the keyboards, that they can do that, because a lot of it was handmade in the studio, like you were saying, and they didn't have that technical capability yet. But it's amazing what you can do today on stage.
Yeah, really. Impossible back in their day. I mean, and so at Shea, um, the one of the reasons Shea is so popular, I mean, is so important, is the technology.
Mm,
Nobody could hear them. The screaming, the way the whole stadium is constructed. It's all a wall and then open behind the Beatles. So all the sound was directed onto them.
right,
And many of the tech guys that were there filming that night had permanent ear damage. And many of the fans I talked to said their ears rang for days and days. But nobody could hear the Beatles. Nobody could see them. It's before the diamond boards and everything. And technology woke up the next day and said, "This is the future," and we failed miserably. And they mere 4 years later, there was Woodstock with 500,000 people, and everybody could hear them and everybody could see them. So that's just one of the things that Shea Stadium changed.
right. And obviously the Beatles stopped touring within a year, but when do you think that, because it always looked like the Beatles had fun to me, even, and all the footage that you can see, but when do you think it turned from, wow, this is a lot of fun, to why bother doing this anymore on stage? When do you think that really clicked with them?
Would say 65 was the greatest touring year that they had.
Mhm,
And it was still tons and tons of fun. But 66 was a drag
yeah,
on them. And then, that was the year John said, "We're more popular than Jesus now." And that's the year that I went to see them. And there was all kinds of literature being handed out, anti-Beatle,
yeah,
pro-Jesus stuff, which was, not what he meant at all. Um, he wasn't comparing the Beatles to Jesus. He was just saying there is so much more communication now
mhm,
that we can reach so many more people than Jesus ever reached, is what he was trying to convey. And he said that in confidence to a lady friend who was also a reporter, and she betrayed him with that, I think. But people were burning Beatle albums,
yeah,
and indeed they played Shea again in 66 and they couldn't fill it. It was half empty, and when George was reminded of that decades later, he famously said, "We played Shea twice." All they remembered was 65.
right. And I think they had such a great set list that night, even though it was so short. Rock and roll music, and did they do rock and roll music at Shea? I think they did, or maybe that was
No,
something
I
different
think that was later.
later. But they did Babies in Black, right? And am I totally messing this
I
up? Or
should know this.
I
I
think they
should
did
know this.
Babies in Black, but songs that weren't necessarily big hits. But what songs do you think that the Beatles should have done live that maybe they didn't?
Well, I remember they opened with "Twist and Shout," which
Yep.
isn't even their song.
Right.
Right? It's the Isley Brothers, but and that was the thing. I'm 10. The Isley Who, so they recorded a lot of other people's music and a lot of Chuck Berry,
Mm,
um, and lesser known names. And I learned about rock and roll because of that. Well, who is this? You know, who are these Isley Brothers? Oh, wow, listen to this song, Shout. Man, these guys cooked. So it was a great, and the Stones did the same thing, a lot of blues.
Mhm.
Um, and the early Stones albums are so bluesy. And and I would go back and buy those people's albums, and so it was a real wonderful education. Um, but to answer your question, I just couldn't say. I
Yeah,
don't
I mean, they
know.
couldn't have done many ballads because, like you said, that no one could hear them anyways. So I'm sure that would have frustrated them even more if they were trying to sing "And I Love Her" and they were screaming people everywhere. Oh.
Yeah, I'm just not sure.
That kind of is a good segue into my next question, though, because I was fortunate enough to speak with Little Anthony on my show a few months ago.
Oh, wow.
And he's such an amazing guy. And one of the things I asked him was, the Beatles were popularizing black singers' music again, kind of revamping it, Little Richard and Chuck Berry and things like that. And I asked him if he thought that they were, not because I thought so, but I was just wondering what he thought, if he thought the Beatles were stealing that thunder and stealing the sound, or were they impersonating it because they loved it so much? And his answer was they weren't stealing anything, they were just admiring.
Yes.
And I'm wondering
They
what you think about that too.
Oh, yeah, they loved it, and they loved Motown,
Mm,
and, they toured. They asked to tour with Motown singers. Brenda Holloway was on the, 65 tour with them, and, I think Mary Wells toured with them in '66. No, and England and the UK was much more accepting of Black performers. Um, and so when the Beatles found out they were playing to segregated audiences in the US, they wouldn't go on.
yeah.
"What do you mean you don't allow Black people in to buy tickets to this show?" They were horrified by that. So it was a cultural difference, in their country. So that was the way they were raised, but they had a tremendous appreciation for the music that, was produced. And the harmonies,
Oh, the best
of the
harmonies.
Motown sound, they gathered around their little record players, and drank that stuff up, and definitely influenced them.
Yeah. And speaking of influence too, this is kind of the last question I had planned on the Beatles today. Um, do you think that this concert in particular at Shea Stadium paved the way for artists to kind of begin going into stadium shows, or was it the advance in technology? What do you think it was?
No, well, first of all, there were a ton of future rock and rollers in the audience that night. Um, which I love, and 2 of them were Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, and they went backstage, well, down under the stadium into the, ball players' dressing rooms,
Hmm.
and, Sid Bernstein had booked them in New York a couple of times already, the Stones. And Mick turned to Sid Bernstein and said, "Gee, Sid, do you think we'll ever be able to play a stadium show?" And Sid said, "Give it a few years, Mick, and I think you'll make it." So, already they were dreaming, one day we'll be this big. Um, um, but now I have to think of who was there. Joe Walsh was there. Steve Van Zandt was there. Um, 2 future Beatle wives were there. Linda Eastman and, Barbara Bach was there with her little sister, who was the real Beatle fan, and her little Barbara married Ringo, and her little sister married Joe Walsh. I mean, it was like connecting the dots in there. Are you kidding me? This is so incredible. Um,
Bobby Vinton. I was
I was
surprised to
gonna
see
say
Bobby Vinton. I love Bobby Vinton.
Bobby Vinton was there. Bobby Vinton was managed by, oh no, I'm gonna like forget his name because Alan Klein, who
Mm.
was a real crook. Um, but Bobby Vinton was his biggest artist, and he had just signed the Stones.
Oh.
And so the Stones, he was trying to lure the Beatles away from Brian Epstein, which he eventually did, except for Paul. Paul wouldn't go there, and Paul ended up being right, not going there. Um, but so that's why that grouping was there. And so I got to talk to Bobby Vinton, who told me about the evening they rented a yacht and cruised around the stadium. And I wanted to say parked, but I don't think you park a yacht. What do? You dock it or something. And um Bobby Vinton said I was walking with Mick Jagger through the stadium,
Mm.
trying to get down to where the Beatles were, and Mick got recognized. And these tough guys like from Brooklyn and the Bronx, they always wanted to challenge Mick Jagger, like, you think you're so tough. And they started chasing him, and Mick is like running, and Bobby said, and I'm running, and we're frightened. And then all of a sudden I realized they're not running after me. They're running after him. So he said, I just laughed, and Mick eventually escaped harm. But I had the best stories, and I interviewed at least one person from each of the five opening acts,
Oh.
um, who were, this was the opening gig of their tour. And then they toured for a couple of weeks on private planes with with the Beatles. And this is one of my favorite stories. There was a woman, there was a group of dancers that were the first act to go on. They called them the discotheque dancers. And it was five girls and a guy, five girls in little white boots, doing
Mm-hmm.
the swim and the frug or whatever. And they all met the Beatles that evening in the stadium before they went on. And she locked eyes with Paul, and that was that. Paul picked her. She knew he picked her, and she was happy about it. And later, and Dave Glide said, "Oh, well, they always booked a girl group um to go on tour with because you could get in trouble picking fans
Mm.
um to date. Um so if there was a nice selection of girls that were touring with you, you were bound to have less trouble. The Beatles never uh picked fans. First of all, they were way too young, the fans. They were 12 and 14 and 15, and some were 21, and probably some of those got picked. But girls were supplied wherever they went, which was, I thought, I was so young. We had known that, oh my God. But so this one girl that Paul instantly selected, she after the concert, they all went back to this hotel in New York, and she was rooming with another girl in the act, and Paul and Ringo came to their room. It's just like midnight now. And they asked if they had a hair dryer that they could borrow. This woman, Dawn, her name is Dawn, goes, "Oh, yeah, like they wanted a hair dryer." And back in the day, all they had were those big bubble hair dryers that you put on your head, or these caps that were attached to with a long hose to, they didn't have blow dryers back then. So the boys came into the room and they were jumping on the beds, and Dawn was like, "Oh yeah, this is going to be really fun." But her roommate said, Out you go. No way." So weeks and weeks later, so Dawn tells me that story, and it's so funny, and it's so um innocent,
Mm.
right? I mean, today they send a gopher down to your room and say, Steve wants you in his suite, and but then they made these little silly excuses. So weeks and weeks later, I'm reading this interview with Brenda Holloway, who was very young. She was like 17. And there's a knock on her door one night, and she thought, "Who's coming to see me? Everybody's coming to see the Beatles. Who's knocking on my door?" And it was Ringo. And he says to her, "Do you have a hair dryer I can borrow?" And I'm like screaming with laughter at this point, because this is clearly their entree.
Mm-hmm.
And she was so naive that she loaned him her hair dryer. And I just wanted to be in the room when he came back to the suite and
Later.
had to tell the guys, she gave me her hair dryer. And it was so sweet and adorable. So there was, even though girls were being supplied and there was sex happening, and um it was still on such an innocent level that, so I had so much fun talking to these people. And one of those dancers, at another city on the tour, uh she collapsed after the act, or maybe it was during a rehearsal, I'm not sure, but she was just exhausted and wasn't eating properly or hydrating, or um and they found a quiet room for her to rest in the stadium that they were playing there. And she said, "I woke up and Paul was sitting by the cot that they had me on, and he was by himself, and he just wanted to make sure she was okay."
Wow.
No sex, no, come on, no. And she said, and I was too young and innocent and petrified to grab him, but that it said so much about who they were. Real people. And Paul's mom was a nurse, and I think some of that rubbed off on him, taking care of people, and that he was down there and they didn't send somebody down to see if she was okay. So there were so many stories like that were so human and touching and endearing and silly and fun. And so on this tour, and it was on this tour they got to meet Elvis. Um, so I would say 65 was so overwhelming for them in a wonderful, wonderful way. And within a very short time, they did acid,
Mm.
they smoked pot. The changes were so dramatic. Um, but at this point, it was still pretty even. And Paul, John and George were the two who were dosed with acid at a party, and their wives. And they were furious when they found out, but they had this amazing experience. And they said that they could not even relate to Paul and Ringo until they also did acid. And Paul didn't want to. He was like the last one.
Mm.
Um, and then I think he privately tried it and then saw what the rest were talking about. But 65 was a huge year for them, just huge.
I love those stories, and one of my favorite stories and was uh well, my friend Eddie Deason. I'm not sure if you know Eddie, but
Sure.
yeah,
I know Eddie.
we talked. We loves the Beatles, obviously. We were doing some Beatles trivia, and he asked me if I knew who the first Beatle to smoke marijuana was and what he did wrong. And he told me it was Ringo with when the Beatles met Bob Dylan,
Right.
and Bob Dylan handed them a joint, and Ringo was just going to town puffing it, and he wasn't sharing it with anybody. And because apparently John didn't want to take a hit of it, and so he passed it to Ringo, and Ringo was, to use Eddie's words, he was bogarting the joint. And I love that story. It was just,
Well, later, I mean, John, it's no secret that he tried a lot of other drugs
mm,
as well and had a heroin addiction problem, he and Yoko, for
really?
a while, which that song Cold Turkey is
Mm,
about getting off of heroin. But I have this rare, at least I think it's rare, color video footage of John and Bob Dylan in a limo together right after they'd shot up.
mm,
I think they cover the lens when they shoot up, and then, um, John was just gloriously staring out the window while Dylan, got very nauseous more and more and more, and they had to turn around and go home. But, like, I have this footage,
wow.
which is insane. But, another thing that I have in Top of the Mountain is, like, 200 photos
Mm,
of the Beatles that no one has ever seen. So, like, Dawn, the lovely Dawn Michaels, who was in the first, um, opening act, while I'm we have become very good friends, and while we're talking, she said, "Well, I'm from New York, and my dad came to the concert, and he took 80 color slides that we watched once and put in a drawer. Would you like them?" And I'm like,
yes.
what do I have to pay for them?" "Oh, postage." So she let me have these photos, and she was a dancer. She danced on Broadway. Um, she danced on Broadway, and then when rock and roll came in, more and more, she started ba dancing backup for performers, and she danced for Marvin Gaye,
Oh wow.
and Marvin Gaye was at Shea Stadium.
Everyone was there.
So, they had all these DJs from, New York, and one of the DJs brought Marvin Gaye up on stage. He didn't sing or perform, and he had his own movie camera, and I would love to know what happened to that footage. But, there it was I always heard he was there, but I could not prove that he was there. But Dawn's father took this gorgeous color slide of Marvin because he knew him, because Dawn had performed with him. That's where I saw the movie camera in his hand. And, and he took pictures of Ed Sullivan and Sid Bernstein and, um, and a lot of wonderful crowd photos. Carly Simon's brother was there, and he took amazing photos, uh, on the stage and of the crowd, of the non-segregated crowd, um, which was fabulous. Which they were just fabulous. People had sheets that they unfurled that, they had written messages on. "John, we love you," and, Meryl Streep was in the audience. She was 16. This boy had invited her, and her parents were afraid to let her go.
Mm.
But they finally, she said, she washed dishes for weeks until they said yes. And she said, I had my little sign, Paul, I love you. And she said, I had a better view of New Jersey than I did of the Beatles, but I was there and it was awesome. And later they asked her to introduce Paul when he was being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, talk about full circle moments. Um, so this one young man, and I dedicated the book to him, and he passed away before I finished the book. Um, he had seen the Beatles in Baltimore, where he was from, and he had managed to get in front of the stage and took some great photos. And so he was determined that this was going to happen at Shea Stadium. So he had a really nice camera that was his uncle's, and it looked pretty professional. And he had taken a business card from his local radio station and laminated it, and that was his ID. And knowing that the mayor of New York was terrified about security, and it took Sid Bernstein many, many meetings with them to assure that, they had police on horseback, they had barricades, and as a last alternative, Sid had like 30 judo and karate experts placed on the field, right? Like, come on, this is crazy. So, but this one young man, um, he was determined to get onto the field. So while all the fans are going up to their seats, he was looking how to go down into the stadium, and he finds a door and he goes down, and it's a hallway full of doors, and each one he tries is locked, locked,
Oh,
locked. And finally one opens, and he opens it and it's full of policemen. And
oh,
he right, he goes, oh shit. And he thought, and in a split second, he thought, if I close the door, they're going to come after me. So he walked in, he faked a British accent. He said he was friends with George Harrison and he was supposed to um, take photos that night, but he got separated from the crowd. Now, this is a 17-year-old kid, and he's wearing his lucky bar mitzvah suit. So if you know anything about that, the suit was 4 years old and 3 inches too short and tight and ill-fitting. And we knew nothing about British people until the British invasion happened. So the police took one look at this guy in this funny suit and thought, oh, yeah, he's British. And they lead him directly onto the field.
wow.
And now he's standing between Ed Sullivan and Brian Epstein at the foot of the stage from where he takes 60 never before seen photos. And he sold the photos years before to someone who only made trading cards of them and who never put them in a book or anything. But in his contract, he was allowed one use of all the photos, and he gave that permission to me.
Wow.
So one of those photos is on the cover of the book, and the rest are all in the book. So I never dreamed that I would find unseen photos of the Beatles. I mean, after all these years, but I did. So that was another wonderful, wonderful part of the story.
That's incredible. It really is. And folks listening, the book is top of the mountain. Make sure you pick up a copy because for any Beatles fan or non-Beatles fan, it's a must-have. You'll learn so much about an incredible historic night that has seriously paved the way in music history. Incredible. Laurie, before we wrap things up, I wanted to touch on one of your other books really quick too, Timmy's in the Well, because as you know, John means a lot to me, and so does Lassie, and so writing that book with him must have been an incredible experience. And I'm wondering what the most rewarding part of digging through his Lassie years together to put that story on paper. What was the best part?
one of the best parts was, all the reunions that, occurred because of it.
Mm.
I tracked down people he hadn't seen for 60 years. Um, People who were, on the crew, actors that worked with him, tutors on the set because he couldn't go to a real school. Um, so, and also things he remembered being from working on the set were in the mind of a child,
Right.
the perspective of a child. But then I had the perspective of adults, um, and who told me things about him and his experiences that he didn't recall.
Mm.
Some were very wonderful, hilarious stories, and some were painful.
Mm.
And here I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and thinking, wouldn't it be great to be a famous kid actor? But it wasn't that great. There were he got to experience a lot of things that other children would never get to experience, and people that he met. Um, but he missed out on so much. So by the time he got to college and his hair was long and he had a mustache and um, he was, several years removed from the show, um, people didn't instantly recognize him. And he loved going to parties and hearing about what other kids did, things he never had the opportunity to do, like Little League or summer camp. And he was fascinated by those stories and what people experienced. And he said, as soon as they found out who I was and what I did, all of that conversation stopped. And I felt like a freak in the room.
Mm.
And I was like, are you kidding? You felt like a freak? So that really surprised me. And I saw, again, so many pictures of him with famous people of the day, silent screen stars, Buster Keaton, um, unique television stars like Ernie Kovacs, and just some brilliant people. And what was that like? And he said, Laurie, as long as it took to take the photo is as long as I was with that person. I've no memory of meeting him. So his life was so disjointed and broken up. And all of his peers he met at birthday parties or special PR functions.
Mm.
Don't get dirty. Don't play in the grass. Comb your hair. It's only years and years later with these, now they're called Comic Cons. We used to call them autograph shows. But it's only there, when he started doing those in the 90s, that the relationships really were allowed to develop. He was the only child on his set.
Mhm.
And he was in almost every scene. Um, so he didn't get to, he had solitary fun.
Yeah.
He had to create fun for himself. And I learned so much about him. And he learned so much about what he experienced. So it was just it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I spent years tracking people down and hearing their stories. And it's a very, very special book. And we have recently updated it, and it'll be a wonderful thing for his grandchildren to read one day.
Absolutely. Some amazing stories, and I love talking to him, and I love talking to you too. You're both amazing people, and thank you so much for being here today. I hope you guys
Oh,
find
it was
yourselves
great.
in New England at some point at a Comic Con or something, because I'd love to meet you both in person.
And where are you?
I'm in Massachusetts, but I travel, so.
I went to Emerson.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay, Henry Winkler actually just gave the commencement speech at Emerson like, just a couple days
really.
ago. Yeah.
And I keep seeing, in a recent poll by Emerson College, and I'm
Hmm.
like, "Really? Okay." We were just a little, fine arts college when I went there, so apparently it's enlarged its reputation.
Just a little bit. But yeah, this has been so great, and thank you so much for sharing your stories. I've loved hearing about them, especially about the Beatles. You know, being a Beatles fan, this is just really awesome. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for asking me.
And for everybody listening, I'll see y'all again very soon. I got some episodes in the works for the summer, so we're gonna have a lot of fun continuing this in the green room journey. And until then, may God bless, and we'll see you soon.